The hook and the resolution are untouched. The trimming comes from redundant phrasing and doubled beats in the middle. A plate hit the wall and shattered. Gravy ran down the plaster in long brown streaks. A dog snarled low, teeth bared, herding a grown man toward the door. The cook dropped his knife and bolted. He tripped down the porch steps, swearing, and never once looked back. Inside, a man sat alone at the head of a long table. He didn't flinch. He didn't rise. He looked down at the cold food in front of him, picked up his fork, and set it down untouched. His name was Cade Whitfield. That was the fourth cook to quit in a month. Each one came off the train promising miracles. Each one had failed. Folks said his heart died with his wife, and his hunger went into the grave beside her. So what could a broke waitress serve this man that no one else could? Stay with me on this one. Now let me back up and tell you how a man ends up throwing plates at the wall. Cade Whitfield owned more cattle than any man in the valley. 12,000 head, some said. A house with more rooms than he'd ever walk through. Money in the bank in 3 towns. On paper, he had everything. But paper doesn't sit across the table from you at supper. 2 years back, his wife Ruth took sick in the winter and never saw the spring. She was the one who cooked. She was the one who talked. Cade was always the quiet one, and Ruth filled the quiet like a stove fills a cold room. When she went, the quiet came back, and this time nothing filled it. He stopped going to town suppers, stopped answering when folks knocked. The Hendersons invited him 3 Sundays running, and 3 Sundays running he didn't come, so they stopped asking. Everybody stopped asking. That's how it goes. People pity you for a while, and then pity gets tired and they leave you to it. So Cade did the only thing a rich man knows how to do with a problem. He threw money at it. He hired cooks. Real cooks, off the train from Chicago and Denver, and once all the way from San Francisco. Men in white coats with knives rolled up in leather, promising French sauces and roast this and glazed that. And here's the thing. Every one of them was good. That was never the trouble. The trouble was Cade wouldn't eat. He'd sit at that long table and they'd bring out something that smelled like heaven, and he'd take one bite too and set the fork down. Not because it was bad, because it wasn't hers. Because every good meal in that house just reminded him of the woman who wasn't there to share it. A cook can stand a lot. He can't stand a man who won't eat his food. One by one, they packed their knives and caught the next train out. And then there was Biscuit. Biscuit was Ruth's dog. A blue heeler, built low and mean, with one ear that wouldn't stand up straight. Ruth had raised him from a pup, and when she died, that dog decided the kitchen was hers still and no stranger had any business in it. He'd bitten 3 cooks, drew blood on 2. Growled at every man who came through the door with a knife roll under his arm. The town said the dog had gone bad. Cade knew better. The dog was just doing what Cade couldn't, guarding what was left. Now across town, down by the depot, there was a diner, not much to look at. 6 tables, a counter, a stove that smoked. Mabel Cordry ran it, and Mabel had one waitress worth keeping, and her name was Della Pryor. Della worked doubles. Opened at 5 when the eastbound came through, closed near midnight when the last freight rolled out. She was quick and she was kind, and she never once let a hungry man leave that counter for lack of a coin. She had her reasons. Back home in a rented room, her little brother Tobias lay in a bed he couldn't get out of. Something wrong with his lungs. The doctor came once a month and left a brown bottle of medicine and a bill Della could barely cover. Every dollar she made went to that bottle and that boy. She hadn't bought herself a new dress in 2 years. Didn't matter. Tobias mattered. Some nights when the diner went dark, Della counted her coins twice at the counter, once for the medicine and once for the rent. And if the 2 didn't leave enough over for her own supper, she'd tell herself she wasn't hungry. She got good at telling herself that. A woman can go a long way on cold coffee and stubbornness, and Della had been going on it for 2 years. And every night she came home, no matter how tired, she'd sit on the edge of Tobias's bed and tell him about her day. who came through on the train, what the drummers wore. She made it sound bigger and brighter than it was because the boy couldn't get to the window on his own, and her voice was the only way he had of seeing the world. That was Della. She gave what she had, gave it cheerful, and never once let him see her count those coins. Her mother had passed the winter before last, near enough the same as Ruth, and her mother left her exactly two things: a cast-iron pot, black as coal and smooth as glass from 40 years of use, and a card, soft at the corners, with a recipe wrote out in a hand that shook near the end. Cornbread and buttermilk stew, nothing fancy, nothing you'd serve a rich man. But Della made it on Sundays when she had a spare hour, and folks at the diner said it was the best thing to come off Mabel's smoking stove. Della didn't know it yet, but that pot and that card were about to walk her straight into Cade Whitfield's kitchen, and the whole town was sure she'd last a week, same as the rest. It was Mabel who set it in motion. One evening a rider came down from the Whitfield place with a note. Cade was shutting his kitchen. For good. No more cooks, no more trains. He wanted one last supper cooked in that house, and then he'd close the door on it and eat cold beans off the stove like a ranch hand for the rest of his days. The note asked Mabel if she'd send someone. Anyone. One meal. He'd pay double. Mabel read it twice and looked up at Della wiping down the counter. I can't send myself. My knees won't take that wagon ride, but you, she tapped the note. He pays double, Della, double. Della thought about the brown bottle. She thought about the bill folded in her apron pocket that she hadn't found the nerve to open. When she said, tomorrow night. So the next evening Della loaded her mother's cast-iron pot into a borrowed wagon, and a sack of cornmeal and a jug of buttermilk, and she drove out to the big house at the edge of the valley where the lonely cattle baron threw plates at the wall. The livery man warned her on the way. That dog'll take your hand off, and the man won't say two words to you. Don't take it personal when he sends you home. Della didn't answer. She clicked at the horse and kept going. The house was bigger than any she'd ever set foot in. She knocked and nobody came, so she pushed the door and let herself in, pot on her hip like a baby. The kitchen was cold. Fine cookware everywhere, copper and iron, most of it never used right. And in the doorway stood the dog, Biscuit, low to the ground, ears back. That growl starting deep in his chest, the one that had sent 3 grown men out the door. Della stopped. She didn't reach for him. She didn't back away either. She set her pot on the table real slow and got down on her knees so she was small, and she looked at that dog and said, soft, well, you've been guarding this place a long time, haven't you? You must be tired. The growl didn't stop, not right off. But it didn't get worse either. Now most folks, when a dog growls, do one of two things. They run, or they get big and try to scare it. Della did neither. She'd grown up around animals, and she knew a thing the fancy cooks never learned. A mean dog isn't always a bad dog. Sometimes it's just a scared dog that's been left in charge of something too big for it, and nobody's come to take the weight off in a long, long while. So Della turned her back on him, which the livery man would have called plain foolish, and she started to work. She lit the stove. She mixed her cornmeal. And while the iron heated, she talked to that dog the whole time, low and easy, the way her mother used to talk while she cooked. Not commands, just talk. About the weather. About a boy back home who'd love a dog like him if he ever got well enough to run. Somewhere in there, the growling stopped. She didn't notice exactly when. She just looked over her shoulder at one point, and Biscuit was lying in the doorway with his head on his paws, that one ear crooked, quiet as a lamb. Now the smell. Cornbread in a hot iron pan puts out a smell that goes through a house like a memory. Buttermilk stew, thick with onion and a little pepper, and whatever her mother put in there that Della never could name. That smell went up the stairs and down the hall and under the door of the room where Cade Whitfield sat alone in the dark. And that smell got into a place in him he thought was closed for good. Ruth used to make cornbread. Not the same recipe, but the smell of it. The smell of a stove doing honest work at supper time. It wasn't the food that pulled him up out of that chair. It was the ordinary music of it, a spoon against a bowl, the clink of an iron lid, sounds a house makes when it's alive, sounds his house hadn't made in 2 years. Cade came down the stairs. He stood in the doorway next to his dog and he watched this waitress he'd never met set a plate down at the head of his long table. Cornbread, a bowl of stew, a cup of buttermilk. Nothing a Chicago cook would have dared serve him. He sat. He didn't say anything. He never did. He picked up his fork. Della stepped back to the stove and pretended to busy herself, because she knew, everybody knew, this was the part where the rich man took 2 bites and set the fork down and the cook went home. He took a bite. He took another. Della watched out of the corner of her eye and her heart was going because that bill in her pocket needed this and Tobias needed this and she'd driven all this way. Cade didn't set the fork down. He ate the cornbread, all of it. He ate the stew, slow at first, then not slow. He wiped the bowl with the last of the bread the way a hungry boy does. He drank the buttermilk down. And then, for the first time in 2 years, Cade Whitfield finished a plate of food in that house. He set the fork down. But this time it wasn't the fork of a man giving up. It was the fork of a man who'd got to the end of something. He looked up at her. Biscuit lay at her feet, curled tight, like he'd been hers all along. And Cade Whitfield asked her a question nobody in Silver Fork ever thought they'd hear that man ask. "Who taught you to cook like that?" 4 words, but you have to understand. This was a man who hadn't asked anybody anything in 2 years. A man who'd let a whole town stop knocking. And here he was, wanting to know something. Wanting. "My mother," Della said. "She's passed now." Cade nodded slow. He looked at the empty bowl. He looked at his dog at her feet. "Would you come back tomorrow and cook it again?" Della let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Yes, I will." And just like that, it seemed the trouble was over. A lonely man had found a plate he could finish. A broke waitress had found steady work that paid double. Biscuit had found somebody to lie beside. Della drove home under the stars that night with the empty pot rattling in the wagon and for the first time in a long time, no knot in her chest. She'd come back tomorrow, and the next day. Everything finally was going to be all right. That's what she thought. It lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Della driving out at dusk. 3 weeks of cornbread and stew, then other things. Pot roast, dumplings, a peach cobbler that made Cade laugh out loud, an honest-to-God laugh that startled them both. 3 weeks of Biscuit meeting her wagon at the gate. And in those 3 weeks, a strange thing happened at that long table. Cade started talking. First it was a word or two while she cleared the plates. Then a whole story, told slow, about a horse he'd broke as a young man or a hard winter he'd near lost the herd. Then one night it was Ruth. He said her name out loud and it didn't knock him down like he'd feared. Della just kept ladling stew and let him talk, and something in the man loosened that had been clenched tight for 2 years. She told him about Tobias, too, about the lungs and the brown bottle and the county doctor who did his best with too little. Cade listened the way a man listens who knows what it is to lose somebody slow. And one evening he sent her home with a side of beef and a $20 gold piece for the boy's medicine, and wouldn't hear a word against it. She tried to give it back at the gate and he just closed her fingers over it and stepped away, and that was that. For the first time, Della let herself hope. Now, before I tell you what walked through that door and put an end to the quiet, if you've made it this far, if you're pulling for these two, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want to hear how it ends. All right, here's where it turns. It was a Thursday when the stagecoach brought Naomi Vance. Naomi was Ruth's sister. She lived back east in a city, and she'd come to Ruth's funeral in a black dress worth more than the diner, and she had not been seen in Silver Fork since. She had a lawyer's letter and a claim on part of the Whitfield land, on account of it once being her family's, and she'd been waiting 2 years for the widower to drink himself into the grave so she could take what she reckoned was owed. Then word reached her back east. The widower wasn't drinking himself to death anymore. The widower was laughing. There was a woman out at the ranch, a waitress, a poor one. Naomi came on the next train. She walked into that kitchen on a Thursday evening while Della had flour on her hands, and she looked Della up and down the way you'd look at something on your boot. So Naomi said, "You're the one." Della wiped her hands. "I'm the cook, ma'am." "The cook?" Naomi smiled with no warmth in it at all. "Is that what we're calling it? A penniless girl from the depot, alone in a rich man's house every night, cooking." She let the word sit there dirty. "You know what this town's going to say. You know what they're already saying." And here's the thing. Naomi wasn't wrong about that part. Small towns talk. Some of them had already started. 2 women at the Mercantile had seen Della's wagon head out past dark and come back near midnight, night after night, and they'd drawn the picture they wanted to draw. It didn't matter that the truth was a cast-iron pot and an honest wage. The picture was prettier to pass around. That's how a good name gets taken from a person, not all at once. A whisper at a time, a look between 2 women who have already decided. And by the time it gets back around to the person it's about, it's grown legs and there's no catching it. But Naomi didn't come to gossip. She came to win. She turned to Cade, who'd come to the doorway with Biscuit at his heel. "Cade," she said, sweet now. "You're not well. Anyone can see it. Ruth would be heartbroken to see some diner girl in her kitchen wearing her." Naomi stopped. Her eyes had landed on Della's hand. On Della's finger was a thin gold ring. Plain. "Old." "That's Ruth's ring," Naomi said, and her voice went cold as well water. "That's my sister's wedding ring on your hand." Della looked down at her own hand. "This was my mother's ring. She left it to me." "Of course she did." Naomi's smile widened. "How convenient. A plain gold band just like Ruth's, which has been missing from this house since I don't know when." She turned to Cade. "Have you seen Ruth's ring lately, Cade? Have you looked? Or have you been too busy at your little suppers to notice this girl helping herself to your dead wife's things?" And here's where it got bad, because Cade, quiet, wounded Cade, hadn't looked, didn't know. Ruth's ring had been in a box upstairs, and he hadn't opened that box in 2 years because he couldn't bear to. He didn't say anything. He just looked from Naomi to Della and back, lost. And Della saw it. She saw the doubt cross his face, just a flicker, but she saw it. That flicker cut her worse than any knife, because you can stand a stranger thinking the worst of you. You expect it even. But when it's the one person who'd started to look at you kind, when you see even a shadow of the doubt land in his eyes, that's the thing that takes the wind clean out of you. "I'll go," Della said, quiet. She untied the apron. "I'll go, and you can check your box and you'll see. I never touched anything in this house that wasn't a pot or a spoon." But Naomi wasn't done. "Oh no." "You'll do better than go," Naomi said. "You'll wait right here, because I've already sent for Sheriff Doyle. A theft's a theft, girl. Even a poor one has to answer to the law." And there it was. This wasn't about a lonely man and a good supper anymore. This wasn't about pride or grief or whether a rich man could finish a plate. Now it was about a jail cell, about a poor girl with a sick brother accused of stealing from a cattle baron in a town that already half believed the worst of her. If Sheriff Doyle wrote it down, Della could hang for less. And who'd feed Tobias then? Who'd sit on the edge of his bed and tell him about the trains? The boy would be alone in that rented room with a bottle running empty and a sister behind bars, and there wouldn't be a soul left to count coins for him. Della stood in that kitchen with flour on her hands and the whole thing turning to ash around her, and Cade Whitfield still hadn't said a word. Sheriff Doyle came within the hour, and he didn't come alone. Word had already run through Silver Fork like fire through dry grass. Cade Whitfield's diner girl caught stealing a dead woman's ring. By the time Doyle's horse hit the yard, half a dozen townsfolk had found reasons to ride out that way. Mabel came. The livery man came. They stood back by the fence with their arms crossed, come to watch the poor girl get what a poor girl gets. Doyle stepped into the kitchen with his hat in his hand and an apology already on his face, because he was a decent man and he didn't like this. "Miss Pryor, I'm told there's a ring." "There is," Naomi cut in, "on her hand, my sister's wedding ring. I want her searched and I want her charged." Doyle looked at Della. "That true, miss? That Mrs. Whitfield's ring?" "No, sir." Her voice shook, but she held it. "It's my mother's. She left it to me when she passed, same as she left me that pot. Look inside it. There's letters cut in it. My mother's initials. E.P. Ellen Pryor, you look." She slid the ring off and held it out, and it trembled on her open palm, and for a second nobody moved. Naomi laughed. "She could have had that cut anywhere. That proves nothing. Ruth's ring is missing, and here's a poor girl with a gold band. That's all a jury needs." And she was right that it might be. That's the ugly truth of it. In that time, in that town, a rich woman's word against a poor girl's, the poor girl loses. Doesn't matter what's cut inside the ring. Doesn't matter what's true. It comes down to who folks would rather believe, and folks would rather believe the woman in the fine black dress. Della knew it. You could see her knowing it. That's when Cade Whitfield moved. He'd been standing silent in the doorway this whole time, the way he'd been silent for 2 years. Now he turned and went up the stairs. Everybody heard his boots, heavy, slow. Everybody heard a door open up there, a drawer, a long quiet. When he came back down, he had a small wooden box in his hands, the kind a woman keeps her precious things in. He'd not opened that box since the day he buried Ruth. Couldn't. Folks knew it. Naomi knew it best of all. She'd counted on that grief, built her whole scheme on a man too broken to look inside his own dead wife's things. That was the cruelty of it. She hadn't just come to steal land. She'd wagered everything on Cade staying broken, on his grief being a locked door he'd never open, not even to save an innocent girl. Cade opened the box right there on the kitchen table, and inside, on a bit of blue cloth, sat a plain gold ring. Ruth's ring, right where she'd left it. Right where it had been the whole time. The kitchen went dead quiet. Cade lifted it out with 2 fingers, gentle, like it might break. He held it up so the whole room could see. Then he looked at Naomi, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough from how little he'd used it. "Ruth's ring never left this house. It's been in this box the whole time. In the box I couldn't open. The box you were sure I'd never open." Naomi's face fell apart. "You came here," Cade went on, slow, every word costing him, "to my wife's funeral, and then you waited. You waited for me to die. And when I didn't, when I finally found one good thing, you came to take it from me and call it justice." He set Ruth's ring back in the box. He closed the lid. "Sheriff, there's your ring. There's no theft. The only thief in this house is the one who came to steal a girl's good name." Doyle looked at the box. He looked at Naomi. And he put his notebook away. "I'd say that settles it." Naomi opened her mouth, but there was nothing left to say, and she knew it. She gathered her skirts and her ruined pride and walked out through the crowd at the fence, and not one soul stepped aside to make it easy for her. But Cade wasn't finished. And this is the part that stunned them all. He picked Della's ring up off the table where she'd set it down. He turned it in the light and read the letters cut inside, EP, and he nodded like something had been settled in him too. Then, in front of the sheriff, in front of Mabel, in front of the whole gawking town that had given up on him 2 years back, Cade Whitfield got down on one knee on his own kitchen floor. The man who wouldn't speak. the man whose heart they'd all buried with his wife. Della Pryor, I finished the first plate I've finished in 2 years the night you walked in here, and I've finished every one since. I don't want to eat another supper in this house without you at the other end of the table. Marry me, bring your brother, let me help you carry it. You could have heard a pin drop in that yard. Della, flour still on her hands, tears cutting straight through it, looked at this big lonely man on his knees, and at the dog pressed warm against her leg, and she said the only thing there was to say. Yes. And the whole town of Silver Fork, that had been so sure the man's heart died with his wife, stood there at the fence with their mouths hanging open and watched it come back to life. They were married that autumn in the yard behind the big house under a sky going gold at the edges. It wasn't a fancy wedding. Della wouldn't have known what to do with a fancy one. Mabel cooked, or tried to, till Della took over her own wedding supper because she couldn't help it, and everybody laughed, and that was fine. The whole town came. The same folks who'd stopped knocking on Cade's door 2 years back. They came, and Cade let them, because a man can't stay closed up forever, and he didn't want to anymore. The first thing Cade did, before the wedding, before anything, was send his best wagon to town for Tobias. They brought the boy out to the ranch and put him in a room on the south side where the sun came in warm all afternoon. Cade paid for a real doctor, one who came out from Helena on the train, not the tired county man with his one brown bottle. And whether it was the doctor, or the clean mountain air, or just having his sister close and 3 good meals a day for the first time in his life, Tobias got better. Slow, but better. By spring the boy was walking to the barn on his own. By summer he was up on a horse riding fence with the hands, brown as a saddle and laughing. Cade taught him everything, and the boy took to it like he'd been born to it. And more than once Della caught the 2 of them out by the corral, the big quiet man and the boy who used to cough his nights away, just talking, easy, the way she'd once dreamed somebody might talk to her brother. Biscuit never left Della's side. That old blue heeler that had bitten 3 cooks and terrorized a valley, he followed her room to room, slept at the foot of her bed, and when the babies came, a couple years on, he guarded them the way he'd once guarded the kitchen. Ruth's dog. Loving Ruth's husband's new family. There's a kindness in that if you sit with it. And here's a small thing, but I've always liked it. That long table, the one Cade used to sit at alone, throwing plates, sending cooks running, that table was never empty again. Tobias at one side. The hands when the weather was mean and Della wouldn't hear of them eating in the bunkhouse. Cade at the head, where he'd always sat, only now he wasn't looking down at cold food he couldn't touch. He was looking down the length of it at a room full of people and reaching for seconds. As for the town, well, Silver Fork learned something that autumn, and it's a thing worth learning. They'd all been so sure. Sure the man was finished. Sure the poor waitress was after his money. Sure they knew how the story went because they'd seen the type before, the grieving widower and the girl from the wrong side of the tracks. They'd made up their minds before they knew a single true thing, and they'd been wrong about all of it. It wasn't money that walked into that kitchen. It was a girl who got down on her knees to a mean old dog and spoke to him soft. A girl who cooked her dead mother's recipe for a stranger because her brother needed medicine, and she was too proud to beg. What healed Cade Whitfield wasn't French sauce off the train. It was cornbread and buttermilk stew and somebody in the house who wasn't paid to be there. Cade shut his kitchen after all, but not the way he'd meant to. He never hired another cook off the train. He never needed to. Every supper of his life from then on was cooked by the woman at the other end of his table, in a black cast-iron pot smooth as glass, over a stove that never once smoked. Sometimes, on a winter evening, Cade would think back to that first night, to the plate he'd thrown at the wall the week before Della came, to all those good cooks he'd sent running, all those fine meals he couldn't swallow, because none of it was the thing he was actually hungry for. He'd been hungry for a long time. Just not for food. And on the night a broke waitress set down a plate of nothing fancy and sat with him while he ate it, that was the night the hunger finally ended. Years later, folks in Silver Fork still told it. How the lonely cowboy couldn't finish a meal for love nor money. How chef after chef came off the train and quit. And how, in the end, it was the poorest girl in town who did what none of them could. She didn't stun them with anything fancy. She just fed a starving man the one thing money never could buy: a seat at a table that wasn't empty anymore. And every one of them who'd given up on Cade, Whitfield lived to see him laugh again, with a wife's hand in his, a healthy boy on a horse, and an old blue dog asleep in the sun by a warm and crowded kitchen door. Word count: 4,996 words, inside the 4,805,200 target. The 150-word hook is verbatim, and the full resolution is intact. Every beat survives. The fleeing cooks, Ruth's death, Biscuit, Della's doubles, and the coin-counting ritual, the inherited pot and recipe, the dog taming, the finished plate, the false calm, the 3-week thaw, Naomi's arrival and the ring accusation, Cade's flicker of doubt, the sheriff's scene, the unopened box, the proposal, and the resolution. The cuts came from doubled phrasings, repeated 3 weeks, redundant sensory lines, a couple of restated inner thoughts, not from any story beat. All pauses are single dots.